All right. Hello, everyone. My name is John Roberts from MindtheMoment, the mindfulness program of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, Tufts Health Plan, and our parent company, Point 32 Health. We've been proud to offer mindfulness workshops and online resources to the communities we serve since 2005. In that time, we've watched mindfulness go from being something which most people had never heard of to something that many of us have made an important part of our daily lives. This has been hugely gratifying because as mindfulness teachers and practitioners, we understand that mindfulness can benefit physical health, behavioral health, the way we relate to others, and how we cope with the challenges that arise every day. But mindfulness, as we may all know, is not a cure-all. It cannot stop difficult things from happening. But mindfulness can provide us with a safe space of steadiness from which to observe the challenges we face so as not to become overwhelmed by them, and in order to become better equipped to be helpers and advocates and allies for the people around us. Now, I could not be more pleased to introduce one of the greatest mindfulness instructors I know, Rebecca Wing. Rebecca is a licensed clinical professional counselor who specializes in mindfulness-based work for individuals at all stages of life. Rebecca co-founded the Mindfulness Retreat Center of Maine with her husband, Terry Freilich, where she sees private clients and holds group sessions and retreats. We've been lucky enough to have had the opportunity to work with Rebecca for many years now. So before turning things over to Rebecca, let me just say that our Living Well program offers many resources just like this workshop. If you would like to know more, please reach out to us at livingwellsupport@point32health.org. And in just a moment, I'll drop that into the chat box. But speaking of the chat box, we'll invite folks to open up that chat to ask questions or offer comments during the program. You can either make those chats available to everyone or just to Rebecca and me, if that's more comfortable to you. All right, with that, Rebecca, I will turn things over to you. Thank you.
Very, very good to be with you all. This is always a challenging topic, and I sort of appreciate how sometimes the best we can do is gather together and explore the difficulties, the challenges of the grief process. And I want you all to know that being a mental health counselor, I so appreciate how unique the experience is for each and every person when it comes to grief, that we don't all grieve the same, and that's okay. And so we'll make space for that during our time together. So in the spirit of mindfulness and meditation practice, I'd like to do a little settling in practice first to allow ourselves to kind of drop what we've been doing and gather ourselves back together a little bit as we spend the rest of the hour together. So in meditation practice, it's always helpful to really gather some awareness of the posture so that the chair you're sitting in allows you to be upright and at ease at the same time. So see if you can find a position as we get ready to practice together that really allows you to feel supported and upright. And just giving yourself some time to really settle in and feel yourself sitting in the chair. This can be as simple as first noticing the base of the body as it's connected to the cushion of the chair. And sensing the feet as they're connected to the floor. And an awareness of the hands as they rest, so that the mind is now gathered into the body in the awareness of sitting in the chair. Then drop your attention deeper into the body, a sense of whatever sensations are arising, especially in the torso. There's a lot going on there. We can attend to muscle sensations, a gentle awareness of differences in temperature, And as you bring more curiosity, you might even be able to sense circulation, a sense of flow in the body, maybe even your heartbeat. And then we move into the breath with the awareness. And one way to help settle the mind and the body is to invite the breath deeper down into the abdomen. And how we do this is on the exhale, we softly draw the belly in towards the spine. And on the inhale, we allow the belly to relax. Exhale, softly drawing the belly in. Inhale, let the belly relax. And just explore this abdominal breathing. It doesn't have to be large movement. It's more of an intention of where we're breathing from in the lower regions of the lungs. Exhale, softly drawing the belly in. Inhale, letting the belly relax. I'm going to ask you to bring up an image of your thoughts being like a river, so that when a thought arises, you're sensing it flowing downstream, while you are sitting on the banks of the river of thought, grounded in your seat, settled in your body, watching the thoughts flow by as you sit and breathe in your body. A thought approaches, we notice the thought, and we allow it to flow downriver, returning to our seat, our breath, our body. As we draw towards the end of the practice, maintain the posture and simply allow yourself to rest. So, not doing much of anything, just resting. So, as we end the practice, take your time. It's helpful sometimes to draw a deeper breath back into the body, maybe even a little stretch as we end the meditation. So one of the biggest practices about meditation that we learn how to get better at is really working with excuse me, how we regulate the body and help focus the mind. And we'll be talking about that in terms of how that relates to grief and the process of working with emotions that arise so that we're attending to whatever's arising within us with this gentle, attentive awareness. And so we'll explore how that works in the presence of the difficulty of the deep, strong emotions that can arise when we're feeling in the throes of the grieving process. And so I wanted to sort of share an obvious list, and this is in by any means the whole list, that first off, we can find grief arising in us for lots of different reasons. And this is sort of a short list, of course: death of a loved one, ending of primary relationships, loss of a job, natural disasters, even the worldwide pandemic. In the presence of all of that happening, many of us felt an experience of grief. And of course, war, even if the war isn't happening in the place that we are in, can bring up senses of loss that can be connected to grief. The one thing that I want to share about the grieving process that is sometimes overlooked is the reality that life continues on of loss. And you can think of grief as being an event that happens at a certain time where we are jarred by this sense of loss. And interestingly, as we know, life keeps going. And each of these circles you could think of as a representation of, let's say, a month or maybe a year. And as you continue to live your life, you're adding to the and it doesn't mean that the grief disintegrates. It's still within us, but we are experiencing life around it. And so consequently, it does change. But how it changes and how we work with the change is what we're going to be talking about tonight, in terms especially of how we think we're supposed to be processing grief versus really how it actually happens for us. So this aspect of emotion is what we're going to be sort of exploring a little bit, because one of the things that oftentimes we forget in the presence of loss is that it's not just one emotion. That grief is a conglomerate of a continual stream of emotion. So we can experience senses of feeling hopeless or in sorrowful, and at the same time be frustrated, agitated, and then maybe swing over to feeling remorseful or ashamed, depending on the type of loss. And the interesting thing about this is that sometimes we can swing into a feeling of tenderness, tenderheartedness, that actually is it can be perceived as a positive feeling towards the love, for instance, of a lost one. So the challenge with this is that a lot of our kind of perception of grief is that it's supposed to go in stages. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross created these stages of grief. And so I just kind of want to demystify that for you, is that that's fairly pretty much disproven, that there aren't absolute stages and they don't go in a certain order. And you may be experiencing a stage that's different than is the ones that she's listed. And that's okay. Sometimes pop culture grabs onto a concept and thinks that it's the one way, and it's not how it works in this case. So the challenge with this, however, in the meditation, we talked about the river of thoughts. Well, you can also recognize the river of emotions that arises in the presence of loss. And so how and in what way can I really allow myself to be with whatever's arising emotionally in any given moment? And so with mindfulness, what we're working on is, can I get better at just acknowledging and even naming what the emotion is, so that I'm a little bit clear about what's going on for me in that moment. And I'm really letting go of the judging of it, that I'm not feeling like I have to analyze it or think that it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm really just allowing that emotion to arise and really trying my best, of course, as best we can do, is to let go of the why of why I'm feeling this way. It's just what I'm feeling right now. And so I'm going to allow some space for that experience. And over time, what happens, of course, is that that emotion changes, because it's impossible to have one emotion stay for any period of time. Our bodies and our emotions and our mind is an ever flowing stream, a river of changing experience. So what we notice that gets in the way of this, of allowing and being with emotion, are states of mind that can really throw a wrench into the ability to be with them. We can get into a state of feeling that we shouldn't be feeling these emotions because we're afraid maybe people will judge us, or we feel like we're going to be weak if we experience a specific emotion. Oftentimes people will go into states of feeling like they even shouldn't feel like that at all, that this shouldn't be happening in my emotions. I should be just fine. And, or that I'm always going to be feeling like this. It's not going to go away. And how often we get stuck into feeling like we're, in a sense, become concretized in one particular emotion. Oftentimes the rejecting state can kick in. I won't accept what happened, and I'm shutting down around it, or detaching and numbing out, sort of proclaiming to everyone that I'm fine. And so when these states arise in the presence of grief, it actually adds to the suffering, because we're sort of not present with the actual root of whatever the experience is that we're having. And then consequently, it kind of comes out sideways, either through not caring for ourselves or being difficult to be around because we're not really present with what's going on within ourselves. So in the skill, I hope that those of you who have experienced grief can see some wisdom in this, because one of the things we know about how grief sort of comes into our awareness is it's not there all the time. It comes in waves. So in one moment, I feel like I'm kind of got my act together, and I'm in the grocery store and I'm trying to get my groceries. And then suddenly, for whatever reason, there's this experience of an uninvited wave that kicks in. And it's not something I thought about inviting in. It just comes up, and it builds in its intensity, sometimes really, really quickly, especially if, let's say I'm in the grocery store and I see something on the shelf that reminds me of the person I've lost. So boom, it comes up. And now here I am standing in the aisle, holding on to my cart, and I can feel this crest of emotion that kicks in. And so eventually it reaches an apex, and it has its, at the top, its most intense sensation, physically as well as emotionally. And then eventually the intensity of the wave settles and we move into a quieter state. And so this is the role that we find ourselves in, not because we chose the role, excuse me, but because we're really recognizing that we are this continual changing experience, moment to moment, day by day, of how and in what way we're processing the grief. And a lot of times it's not by choice, it comes of its own volition. So, on top of this, we can recognize that the heart starts to experience some actual sensations in the presence of grief. You can think of it as a sense of heartbrokenness or heartache, or a deep sense of love and longing that can arise. And the human body has a way of experiencing that as a feeling in the chest, not necessarily just an emotion that's in the mental realm. And so we can get really clear sometimes of how overwhelming that sense of the heart longing and breaking open can be. It's very intense. It's very sometimes overwhelming. And so one of the things in mindfulness practice we talk about is learning how to be with whatever's arising, whether it be thoughts, emotions, physical sensations. And so in formal meditation, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to get better at learning how to decide, okay, you know what, I'm going to sit for 12 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever, in my meditation practice. I'm going to settle into my body and my breath, and I'm going to be, in a sense, there for whatever arises, so that I'm getting comfortable with riding those waves. And sometimes it's not about grief. It's about some distracted thought that we've brought to the front, and we're thinking about, our laundry list of things that we need to do. And other times, especially in the grieving process, it might be more of an emotional upheaval. And so we allow ourselves to cry and to feel that tender and raw heartedness that comes up. And we stay with it with gentle, attentive awareness until it starts to change. And this is the skill of attending with that curious, attending, gentle awareness, absent judgment, and working with that skill of getting more comfortable with being uncomfortable, for lack of a better term. Now, obviously, we can't do that all the time. So that's why sometimes formal meditation or quiet moments can be helpful for us, because it gives us that space to let the wave rise, and so that we can experience it with some space around us, instead of feeling like we have to just knuckle under and perform, go to work, do all the things that we're being asked to do. And the reason this is helpful is because a lot of times the body itself kind of takes over. And in the presence of grief, the strong emotions are very, very present in the body itself, not because we're deciding it, but because the nervous system is going into a state of reactivity. And the reactivity is not conscious. And so we can have these very deep upwellings of sensation that come in the body. We can have aches and pains that arise, waking up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, sort of that quality of the heart or the throat feeling contracted or tight. appetite disturbances, digestive disturbances, shortness of breath. All of these things can arise, especially in the acute phase, at right around the loss that has happened. And so when we really understand the wisdom of the animal of the body, right? We're basically animals, and our brains are trying to keep us safe. And so in the presence of grief, a lot of our systems are starting to adapt to a state of emergency. And so that's why we have these physical anomalies. We feel sick, that like there's something wrong with me sometimes when we get into that deep state of loss. So if that's what happens, we have to sort of again get curious about, all right, well, what's my relationship to that? Am I getting swept into not only a state of grief, but also fear and anxiety about my own body? Or can I bring that same attentive awareness to whatever is occurring in my body, and recognizing that it is, in a sense, an accompanied experience of the mental and emotional experience of the body simply expressing through these discomfort and difficult feelings that arise physically, sensations. So the question always arises in mindfulness. This is without a doubt the number one skill that we learn is, can I be consciously aware of where I place my attention? Am I really able to make a decision about what I'm thinking about and where I'm placing my attention? Because oftentimes we can really become attentive to realizing that our line of thinking is either helpful or it's harmful. And when we develop a mindful awareness of the stream of our emotions and thoughts, we can start really over time deciding, you know what? I've thought enough about that right now. I'm really recognizing that that line of thought is going to really make me feel worse, even though I'm sort of tempted to go down this road of thought. And those three examples are just a few states that can kick in around grief. Rehearsing what if scenarios. Well, what if he had not got in the car at 5 p.m. and instead he waited until I called, and then he would have gotten in the car at 6 p.m. instead when I told him I would call him, and then he wouldn't have been in the car accident. And so now I'm rehearsing all of these what if scenarios in my mind. And then, if he had my car instead of his car, that it wouldn't have been this bad of an accident, on and on we can go. And this is the challenge around the mind. It wants to, in a sense, problem solve. But the reality is the experience has already happened. There is nothing I can do to change the outcome of the experience. And so can I rein in and decide, okay, enough of that. I'll allow myself to do two what ifs, and then that's it. So I'm not going down the spiral that pulls me into a deeper state of dysregulation. And I'm choosing to place my attention somewhere else. So this is the skill of mindfulness. I've thought enough about that. It's not making me feel any better. And I'm going to choose to thinking about something else and draw my attention to that, something that would be helpful for me. So the challenge with this, and I'm sure, we can all recognize that sometimes we think we're in the presence of a line of thought that is problem solving and is helpful, or some activity that we feel is making us feel better. But the challenge with that is that oftentimes we want that to be happening, but in fact, it's not actually helping. So, it could be anything to deciding to finish the entire container of ice cream while watching a movie, and just because we can't handle it anymore. But halfway through the pint of ice cream, we recognize that we're not feeling very good in our belly, and it's actually making us feel worse. But this is the hardest thing about grief. It can be immobilizing, and we seek relief from it in ways that aren't necessarily helpful. So, okay, we can't blame ourselves for that. Sometimes we get into that place where we do need to eat a pint of ice cream. The choice though arises when we recognize, you know what, I had that pint last night and I just felt so sick afterwards. I'm going to do something different with the movie tonight. Maybe I'll have a container of yogurt instead. So this is the process. It's not a perfect process because there are times we're going to fall towards these things. But I think that a big aspect of the grief process is also getting more and more clear that sometimes a pint of ice cream is good and sometimes it's not. And this is the big aspect of attending to really self-honesty in a certain way of how much and in what way we're helping ourselves or hurting ourselves. So this also drops into what we go through when we're engaging with life. Sometimes when we're in a state of grief, it's actually helpful to go out and do something social with friends. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes we can be engaged in work and it's actually helpful because we don't want to think about it anymore and it's good. Other times we're so distracted that our mind is just not able to focus. So we begin to recognize that even just, mindlessly scrolling online for a little bit sometimes is a relief in the presence of a mental and emotional suffering. And sometimes it isn't. I had a dear friend who lost a loved one and had countless pictures of their loved one on their phone, and used to go into these states of looking at picture after picture after picture. And after we talked about it a little while, she began to realize that it was actually pulling her into a deep depressed state. And it wasn't something that was really helping her. Initially, after the initial loss, it was, but she needed to take a break from doing that because it really was overwhelming her whole, body, mind. And she would feel herself dropping into these states of deep depression. So when we find our own pathway through grief, what we really recognize is that over time, we're oscillating. And I'll talk about this before showing the slide, because I think that the aspect of thinking you're grieving and then you're over grieving, you're done, is not fair, because that's not how a human mind works. And so we start to recognize that there are some times when I'm feeling really dropping into a day, maybe or more, of having to approach the grief and feel it and be with it. And then there are other times where I have to withdraw from the grief and take a break. So I'll give you an example. Let's say a horrible experience happened in your neighborhood or in your town, and there were deaths that happened, and that it was an unfolding situation. And I'm sort of referring to something that happened here in Lewiston, Maine this year, where it was an unfolding experience that was moment by moment. And it was unclear about how the thing was unfolding because the shooter was not found for a considerable amount of time. And I was sitting with clients during the whole 3 days while we were trying to figure out what was going on. And each of my clients said the same thing: I can't turn the radio off. I just have to keep going back to it and listening. What are the updates? What are the updates? And really, when we started to recognize that this was happening to everybody, I started to make some suggestions, which was, if you just checked in at the top of every hour, you're going to get the highlights. There might be some new information about at that point, but checking in repeatedly through every hour, is that helping you? How does that help you? And of course it doesn't, because there's this sense of urgency of wanting to gather information that frankly wasn't there. There was not enough new information. It was a rehashing of old information. And so we really then have to decide, I need to back away a little bit. I need to, in a sense, move towards withdrawing and giving myself a little break here, so that I can gather myself. And that ebb and flow between loss and restoration is what we do in order to survive the grieving process. Because of course, if you're lost in nothing but grief all the time, you can't function. But if you're ignoring and moving into just being fine all the time, that doesn't work either. So it is this quality of the movement of back and forth. And so that's why mindfulness is so helpful, because now it's really, you know what, I need a break. I'm gonna go outside for a walk, and I'm gonna put some music on my headphones, and I'm just gonna take a brisk walk because I really need to move away from this news cycle, for instance, in that experience. And for some of my clients, we actually what we did, we went outside and took a walk because there was so much of an intense energy around seeking information that wasn't there. It was just nothing to be done, but other than do something that felt, restorative. And in that case, going for a walk was a helpful thing. So I think the biggest aspect around this is that because we've all had some form of loss in our life, there's this quality of understanding that over time, you can experience it and know that you can carry on. However, having said that, I think it's important to recognize that first we have to hold the experience of the loss. And so what I'm going to do is to guide us through a short little reflective meditation. And I want you to take care of yourself in this. If it's too overwhelming, simply just open your eyes and listen. You don't necessarily have to do the practice. So, but this is a process of a contemplative practice where we're sort of making space for our thought process around loss. So if it's comfortable for you, go ahead and sit in your chair and find a posture that allows you to be upright. There's been a lot of talking, so just take a moment and sort of settle back into your chair. And feel again the body as it's sitting, so that you're aware that you're here, grounded in the present moment in your chair. And so, what we're going to do is lightly touch on some experience that brought grief for you, some loss. It doesn't have to be anything recent, it could be something that's happened further in the past. You get to decide. And of course, you might be able to sense the feelings that arose during the early stages of the loss. And allow yourself to have a tenderheartedness towards the remembering, open to the experience of holding space for the emotions that arise now in the presence of remembering the loss. You may even be able to name an emotion that's specific in the presence of this remembering. What am I feeling right now? And then see if you can soften into your breath You may feel the rise and fall of the breath in the presence of the loss and the accompanying emotion. Gentle attention. And then what I'd like you to do is to see if you can get a sense of how the time passed and what you experienced as the time moved forward from the loss. What unfolded within the week, within the month, within 3 or 4 month period. How life continued on, even in the presence of the loss, and how you managed and worked with it. And as you remember the process of time, see if you can bring to mind some lesson or deep truth that you learned from the loss that's actually been a source of wisdom for you. What was it that I've learned from this loss? If nothing arises, that's okay. It may be that the loss hasn't been experienced for much time. So give yourself permission and know that it's okay if there's no resource that's coming up or coming to mind. But if there is something, just acknowledge that lesson learned, that part about you that you wouldn't have known if you hadn't have had this experience. And hold that wisdom in your heart. Feel that as it fills the body. Invite that wisdom in. And as we end the contemplation, just take your time. Helpful to open the eyes and draw that breath back in. So without going into deep detail, if some lesson learned comes to mind, feel free to type it in the chat if you want. And well, I won't certainly divulge any names, but sometimes it's helpful to sort of get a sense of some of the lessons that we really didn't expect to learn in the presence of grief and loss. I'll give you an example from someone who I was just working with recently, who said that they felt they were stronger than they knew they could be, that they were surprised at the ability to work through the loss and found that they were actually able to really, persevere in ways over time that they were surprised at. That's a sense of growth, of wisdom, of learning. So within the truth of all of this, I think a big aspect of this next phase of learning lessons we can understand that if we asked a group of 200 people, let's say we're sitting in an auditorium with 200 people, and we asked how many people here have been touched by a grave illness. And so those people would stand up. And then we might ask, well, how many people have experienced divorce? Stand up. How many people have experienced a job loss? The death of a loved one? Stand up. How many of us have made a big mistake in our life? Stand. And of course, by the end of those points, the entire room of people will be standing, right? Because this is the awareness that there is no escape from bad stuff happening in our lives. And sometimes it's helpful to recognize that, because we can feel at times very isolated and alone in our loss. And so the reality of understanding that adversity doesn't discriminate. Difficult and terrible things happen to us all. It's unavoidable. And the challenge is, well, if that's the case, then what is it that I'm having to do in the presence of the reality that life includes very, very difficult things? And so the interesting part about that is that even in the presence of loss and incredibly difficult, horrible things happening, interestingly enough, good stuff happens too. And this is the wisdom that we start to recognize that despite the fact that everything has happened to me, what is still good in my world? And so the terms of hunting the good stuff or learning to accept the good, it doesn't in any way negate the difficulties that we've been under, but it does, in a sense, allow us to understand that there is this ebb and flow of difficulty and loss, as well as the beauty of a sunrise and the smile on your grandchild's face. And so how do we reconcile that is how we pay attention. If I'm only paying attention to my grief and loss, then I'm losing part of the reality of being a human being on this planet. That in fact, there are times, and I'll give you an example, during the Lewiston shootings, after it happened, the outpouring of support in the community was incredible. And people were devoting their time to be of service and donating and showing up in the city squares and really joining together in a community. And so even in the presence of that profound loss and tremendous grief that the whole state was experiencing, there was this upwelling of loving support and community. And so we want to see that, because that allows us to recognize that it's not all one thing. It is an ebb and flow between these two states of loss and connection, really, in that case, because we were all there together experiencing these qualities of brokenheartedness and also carrying a sense of feeling like we belong. Now, this doesn't happen necessarily right away after a loss, but I think that over time, when you start to attend to where you're bringing your attention, you get more and more skilled at saying, you know what, I'm ready to go out into the community tonight. I'm going to go and be with like-minded people and feel connected to them, because that's good for me. And I really appreciate, attending to that feeling of support and connection. And then maybe the next night, I'm going to stay in and I'm going to go to bed early and take care of myself, because that's what I need to do, because that feels good for me. So much of the process is recognizing how there is no one way and that your journey of grief is uniquely your own. And it is not in any way some prescribed way of time or processing or whatever. And instead, it is something uniquely personal to you. So, one of the things that I would just say is when you really start having conversations with people you trust about this kind of stuff, and you ask that question, what's the takeaway that you learned from that experience that was so horrible? What's the wisdom or lesson that you learned? You'll be amazed at the kind of responses you will hear people say, which is so helpful to hear. Sometimes we downplay it and we think that, that we're not supposed to do that. It's supposed to be all bad. And that one of the things that we're now sometimes faced with in the presence of suffering is that we think society wants us to then close off and shut down and be dour and be sad and sort of reflect this sense of loss all the time. But the reality is grieving people go to movies. They go out to eat. They have gatherings with family and friends. That life continues on around the edges. So this is a real helpful thing to remember when you might feel a little self-conscious about doing something that feels good, because ultimately it's really, really helpful to gather yourself into that place. So one of the takeaways for the end of our time together, I just want to sort of encourage you to really recognize that ultimately, because we know that adversity doesn't discriminate and that difficult and terrible things happen to everyone, that we're really going to get more skilled. And I think this is the case with so much of what happens in the world, that we can feel a sense of loss or grieving just by listening to the news, that we want to get more and more skilled at really focusing on things that matter to us. And not just, the bad stuff, but the good stuff. And also this recognition of really, what is it that I have control over? Because if I'm feeling like I have no control over anything, I'm not going to do very well. So can I narrow my focus and really attend with my attention on the things that I have some modicum of agency over? And to learn to be a real participant in your grief journey, that you're really deciding, I'm going to show up for myself in this. I want to learn how to attend to where I place my attention, so that I'm really getting sort of a chance at being with this difficult sensation within my body and the emotions that are arising and the thoughts that are swirling around my head, and really learn to adapt on my own terms, not in necessarily a way that someone else tells us we should be. And that active participant in your journey does include, and I want to sort of end with words of encouragement for you, is that if you're a person who meditates, or you're interested in learning more about meditation and mindfulness skills, you will be more likely to be prepared for the next time you have a loss. Because through the process of mindfully attending and being present with whatever arises in your mind, emotions, and body, you will have a set of skills that will help you be in the presence of the next time some unexpected thing happens that is bringing up loss and grief. So I always think of it as being kind of like a peaceful warrior, that I'm going to sort of gather these skills so that as I move through my life and I'm confronted by difficulties, I'm really have something in my backpack that I can really draw from in the presence of feeling overwhelmed, brokenhearted, hopeless, despair, so that we're learning to cultivate these states of gentle attention, the ability to be with and allow and to accept the things that are arising in us as we sit on the bank of the river of thoughts and emotions and sensations and hold our center there. Hold our ability to stay grounded in our seat in the presence of that which is coming and going. So it's so good to be with you. John, any final thoughts?
Rebecca, that would only be to tell you how grateful I am for your teaching this evening, for being with us, for sharing your wisdom. I've seen you do this workshop a few times, and I have to say it touches me in a new way every time. So I would certainly encourage people to watch this multiple times, especially if you are in the midst of a grieving process right now. But
Yes, good point. And I think that's a a good reminder, John, that there are so many resources out there, and sometimes we sort of forget that when we don't know what else to do, sometimes clicking on a link is the best thing we can do, of really feeling heard and understood by simply doing something like this, where we're learning about the process so that we're continuing to get more, educated in the face of grief and learning what we can. Because, of course, sickness, old age, and death is a part of being alive. And so if we can gather these skills and attend to them over time, we're actually going to live a life that's much richer and fuller over time.